John chapter 7 Rivers of Living Water. John chapter 7 is a chapter of argument. Almost nothing happens in it. There's no miracle, no healing, no journey across the lake. What there is instead is a city full of people talking about Jesus, whispering in corners, arguing in the temple courts, contradicting one another, changing their minds, taking sides. John uses a particular Greek word twice in this chapter, schisma, a tearing or a split. The crowd is being torn in two by the question of who this man is. And that is the point. Chapter 6 ended with the most of his followers walking away. Chapter 7 shows the same fracture spreading through Jerusalem. Jesus is not a figure people can remain neutral about. He never has been. To understand this chapter, we need to understand the festival it takes place at. Because almost everything Jesus says here is a direct comment on what was happening around him. The Fest of Booths. John tells us that the Jewish Fest of Booths was at hand, sometimes called Tabernacles or Sukkot. It was one of the three great pilgrimage festivals, and it lasted 7 days, with the 8th day of solemn assembly. During the fest, families built temporary shelters out of branches and lived in them. To remember the 40 years when Israel had no houses at all and lived in tents in the desert, depending entirely on God. 2 ceremonies developed around this fast, and both of them matters enormously for what Jesus says. The first was water ceremony. Each morning of the fast, the priest would carry a golden pitcher down to the pool of Siloam, fill it, and process back up to the temple where the water was poured out at the altar. This recalled the water God gave from the rock in the wilderness. It also looked forward because the prophet had spoken flow out from Jerusalem. Zechariah says exactly that, and Zechariah 14 was among the passages associated with this fast. The second was the illumination. In the court of women, enormous lampstands were lit at night, and the light was said to be bright enough to illuminate every courtyard in the city. It recalled the pillar of fire that led Israel through the darkness. Keep both of those in mind. On the last day of the fast, standing among the people who have been watching water poured out every morning for a week, Jesus will stand up and shout about thirst. And at the beginning of the chapter 8, in the same setting, he will say, I am the light of the world. Even his brothers did not believe in him. The chapter opens with a note that the ground has shifted. Jesus is staying in Galilee because he would not go about in Judea, since the Jewish leader was seeking to kill him. That threat, which appeared for the first time in chapter 5, is now simply the background condition of his ministry. And then his brothers come to him with an advice. Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciple also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. On the surface, it sounds like an ambitious family loyalty. Get yourself in front of the bigger audience. But John cuts underneath it with one flat sentence, for not even his brothers believed in him. Sit with that for a moment. The man who grew up in the same household, who watched him work in the same trade, who knew him better and longer than any disciple, did not believe. It is worth noticing that John does not soften this or explain it away. It is also worth noticing what happened later. The brother named James appears in Acts as a leader of the Jerusalem church and writes a letter that begins by calling himself a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. Something changed, but it has not changed yet. Their advice is essentially a proposal for a public relations strategy. Go where the crowds are, do your best work, and get noticed. It is the same instinct as the crowd in chapter 6 that wanted him to crown him by force. Human beings were arranging Jesus' career for him on entirely reasonable terms. His reply, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here." The word here is kairos, the right or appointed moment, and it is worth distinguishing from the word John usually used for the cross, hora, the hour. But the logic is the same. Jesus does not move on the word schedule. His brother can go whenever they like because nothing hangs on their timing, everything hangs on his. Then he stays behind and afterwards goes up to the feast privately, not publicly, muttering in the crowd. At the fest, everyone is looking for him, and the city is buzzing with a quiet debate. John captures it beautifully. It was much muttering about him among the people. Some says he's a good man, others says no, he's leading the people astray. But no one spoke openly of him for the fear of the Jewish leaders. That is a recognizable social atmosphere, a strong opinion held quietly because saying them out loud carries a cost. But in the middle of the fest, Jesus goes up into the temple and begins teaching. And the reaction is astonishment. How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? They mean that he has no formal credentials. He does not sit under a recognized rabbi. He has no chain of authority to cite, and yet he is teaching with obvious depth. His answer redirects the whole question. My teaching is not mine, but His who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The second sentence deserves attention because it inverts how we usually assume knowledge works. We tend to assume that the understanding comes first and willingness follows. First, I will be convinced, then I will submit. Jesus says the order runs the other way. The person whose will is set to do God's will is the person who will recognize God's voice. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is a claim about what unbelief actually is. The problem is rarely a shortage of evidence. The problem is that we are not neutral parties. Then he adds a test and cuts in both directions. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Moses and the Sabbath. The argument then turns back to something that happened 2 chapters earlier, the healing at the pool on the Sabbath. The controversy has not gone away. Jesus raises in himself, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" The crowd's answer is almost comic in its denial. "You have demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Presumably, these are pilgrims from out of the town who genuinely do not know what the leadership has been planning. Then Jesus makes an argument from within their own legal reasoning. Moses gave the command of circumcision, which is to be performed on the 8th day. If a boy's 8th day falls on the Sabbath, circumcision is performed anyway. The requirement of the law is not suspended. So he says, if you circumcise a man on a Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? It is an argument from lesser to greater. It is an unanswerable on their term. And it is unanswerable on their own terms. If a ritual act affecting one part of the body is permitted on the Sabbath, how can the healing of an entire body be forbidden? And then a sentence that summarizes much of this chapter. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. That is precisely what everyone in Jerusalem is failing to do. They're judging by accent, by geography, by credentials, by rumors. We know where this man comes from. Some in Jerusalem begin to reason it out. Isn't this man they want to kill? And yet here he is, speaking openly, and nobody stops him. Have the authorities concluded he really is the Christ? Then they raise an objection. We know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. This is a popular expectation that Messiah's origin would be mysterious. And so they disqualify Jesus on a ground that they know his hometown. John's whole gospel has been quietly setting up the irony. They think knowing Nazareth means knowing his origin. Chapter 1 told us his origin in the beginning with God. They are certain about one thing they are most wrong about. Jesus responds by shouting in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come on my own accord. He who sent me is true, and in him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." They try to arrest him, but no one lays a hand on him because his hour has not yet come. That refrain again, that timing is not in their control. Others in the crowd move the other way. When Christ appears, will he do more sign than this man has done? Officers who could not make the arrest. The Pharisees and chief priests sent temple officers to arrest him. And Jesus says something they do not understand at all. I will be with you a little longer, and then I'm going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. The crowd puzzles over it. Is he going to the dispersion among the Greeks? They are guessing wildly, and as often happen in John, saying something truer than they know. The gospel will indeed go out to the Greeks. Then the last day of the fast arrives, the great day. 7 morning of the water pouring out at the altar are behind them. And Jesus stands up and cries out, "If anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." The setting makes this an audacious claim. The ceremony that has been enacted every morning of the fast, the water carried up from Siloam, the memory of the rock in the desert, and prophetic hope of the living water flowing out of Jerusalem. Jesus stands in the middle of it and says the source is himself. There is a well-known question about how to punctuate those two verses, since the earliest manuscript had no punctuation. On one reading, the rivers flow from the heart of the believer. On another, the his refers to Christ, and the river flows from him. Both readings have been defended by careful interpreters, and both are theologically coherent. The believer has no water that did not come from Christ in the first place, and the same gospel will show blood and water flowing from his pierced side. What John does not leave ambiguous is the meaning. He adds a note. Now, this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believe in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. That is a remarkable statement and precise. John is not saying the Spirit did not exist or was enacted before this. The Old Testament says otherwise on every page. He is saying that the Spirit has not yet been given in the way promised, and that the giving waits on glorification of Jesus. And in this gospel, glorification means the cross. The Spirit is poured out. On the other side of the Calvary, the river flows from a death. No one ever spoke like this man. Now the divisions multiply. Some says he is a prophet. Some says he is a Christ. Others object that the Christ comes from Bethlehem, from David's line, not from Galilee. There is a deep irony in that objection which John never bothers to explain, presumably because he expects his readers to catch it. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and he was in David's line. Their disqualifying argument would, if they have bothered to check, have been an argument in his favor. They are so confident in what they know and they do not investigate. So there was a division among the people over him. The word is schisma. Then the officers returned to the chief priests and Pharisees empty-handed. Why did you not bring him? Their answer is one of the most memorable lines in this chapter. No one ever spoke like this man. They were sent to arrest him and they stood like listening instead. They were sent to arrest him and they stood there listening instead. The Pharisees' response is contemptuous, and it is a study in how elites dismiss what they cannot answer. Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? But the crowd that does not know the law is accursed. It is not an argument, it is a claim about who is respectable and who is ignorant. And then Nicodemus speaks. We have met him before, the ruler who came at night in chapter 3 and could not follow the conversation about being born from above. Now he is in the council chamber and it says, carefully and procedurally, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing or learning what it does? This is not a bold confession. He does not say Jesus is the Christ. He appeals to due process. But it is more than anyone else in this room is willing to say, and it costs him. They turned on him immediately. Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arise from Galilee, which is once again factually careless. Prophets had come from the north, and Isaiah had written that the Galilee of the nations, on the people who walked in darkness, its great light would shine. They tell Nicodemus to search, and searching is exactly what would have undone their argument. Then everyone goes home. The chapter ends. A note here for anyone reading along in a printed Bible: the last verse in this chapter 7 and the opening verse of chapter 8, the account of a woman caught in adultery, are marked in most modern translation with a bracket or a footnote because they are absent from the earliest manuscript of John. We'll look at the question properly when we come to chapter 8. How this chapter reveals Christ. He's the one who moves on the Father's timetable and not on ours. Refusing his brother's strategy, refusing the crowd's crown, unavailable for arrest until his hour comes. He is the teacher whose authority does not come from credentials, because his teaching is not his own but the Father's. He is the one who reveals what unbelief actually is, that a shortage of evidence, but a will that does not want God's will. Judging by appearances instead of rightly. He is the fulfillment of the feast. The rock in the wilderness, the living water in the prophet had been pouring out all week in pantomime, the source of the river that Zechariah said would flow from Jerusalem. And he is the giver of the Spirit, who will not be given until he is glorified, which means the Spirit comes to us by the way of his death. Trace the order of grace and it holds. Everything offered in this chapter is offered to the thirsty on the basis of coming and drinking. The one condition is a thirst. The one condition is thirst, which is not an accomplishment but a lack. And what flows out afterward, the rivers of living water. It's not something that believers generate. It comes from a source outside himself, given only after Jesus is glorified. Final reflection. The city was full of people with opinions. He is a good man. He is leading the people astray. He is a demon. He is a prophet. He cannot be the Christ because we know where he comes from. No prophet comes from Galilee. Every voice confident, most of them wrong, and almost all of them judging by appearances. And in the middle of that noise, a man stands up on the last and greatest day of the fast, while the water is still wet on the altar stones, and shouts an invitation that requires no expertise at all. If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Not if anyone qualifies, not if anyone has studied, not if anyone comes from the right region or belongs to the right party, if anyone thirsts. The officers went to arrest him and came back saying they had never heard anyone speak like this. They were more right than they knew. And the water he promised would not begin to flow until the day he was lifted up and glorified, poured out at last from the cross.